As a civilization centralizes its power, it generates a demographic byproduct: political dissidents, disgraced elites, and defeated populations. To maintain order at the core, the state must find a peripheral zone to absorb them. Throughout antiquity, the Mediterranean powers of Rome, Greece, and Persia engineered the African continent to serve exactly this function. They utilized the landmass as a geopolitical pressure valve. This is a map of ancient North Africa, showing the formal terminology these empires used to divide the frontier. Greek and Roman administrators partitioned the landscape into strict zones: Libya, Aethiopia, and Mauritania. Ancient Greek historians extensively documented the deliberate engineering of these remote territories. Writing in the 5th century BCE, Herodotus explicitly described the Libyan interior as a remote dumping ground. He recorded that the region was actively populated by displaced Mediterranean groups, fugitives, and tribal factions pushed far beyond the boundaries of settled Greek law. The Persian Empire relied on identical imperial mechanics. Records like the Behistun inscription detail how Persian kings crushed rebellions and executed the mass deportation of the surviving defeated populations into distant territories, including North Africa and Egypt. This 15th century map, based on Claudius Ptolemy's geographic framework, shows how deeply this divided peripheral Africa was cemented into European cartography. By marking regions like Libya Interior and Aethiopia, ancient geographers formalized the idea of a wild frontier existing in perpetual exile from civilized society. Eurasian civilizations treated the African landmass as an administrative tool for political and demographic containment. Processing and relocating thousands of human beings across a continent requires a highly formalized bureaucracy. Rome codified this through specific legal penalties: relegatio and deportatio. Relegatio was a legal mandate forcing a citizen into temporary exile, while deportatio required permanent banishment to a remote province, stripping the individual of their citizenship entirely. Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius recorded emperors routinely deploying these laws. Disgraced senators, political enemies, and deposed officials were systematically banished to heavily guarded frontier provinces like Africa Proconsularis and Numidia. This legal displacement escalated into a specific mode of counterinsurgency. During the Tacfarinus revolt in the 1st century CE, Rome targeted the civilian foundations of the frontier, systematically burning villages and executing the forced relocation of entire indigenous tribes. The legal bureaucracy of exile was ultimately backed by the physical violence required to enforce it. When the state needed to ensure total pacification, it deployed the strategy of urban annihilation. In 1466 BCE, Roman legions under Scipio Aemilianus breached the walls of Carthage. Over several days, they executed one of history's earliest recorded acts of deliberate total urban extermination. The scale of the destruction was absolute. Following a prolonged slaughter of the inhabitants, the Roman state systematically enslaved the remaining 50,000 survivors and burned the city to the ground. As Roman borders pushed deeper into Numidia and Mauritania, military suppression was continually paired with the mass enslavement of resisting populations. The demographic destruction was sustained by the physical presence of the Roman military apparatus. Frontier legions stationed in massive North African colonies enforced a constant state of violent extraction. The Mediterranean core subjected the continent's northern periphery to a heavily institutionalized, cyclical algorithm of community destruction and mass enslavement. Once you push diverse, traumatized populations together into the exact same harsh geographic space, they inevitably adapt to survive. The African frontier became a highly pressurized crucible. Forced outside civic jurisdiction, these displaced groups intermingled to form complex, unauthorized societies. Among these exiles was a specific class of cultural outcasts, magical and ritual specialists, actively expelled from classical city-states for social deviance. The Greeks called them the pharmakeis, practitioners who manipulated illicit drugs, deadly herbal poisons, and forbidden sacrificial substances. Pushed to the fringes, they migrated to remote Libyan territories where their practices were tolerated. This fragment of the Greek magical papyri provides direct archaeological evidence of secret cults operating across the North African frontier. These records catalog the exiles' illicit knowledge: herbal intoxicants, ecstatic trance ceremonies, necromancy, and curse tablets. These specialists moved along vital Mediterranean-Sahara trade routes, intertwining with indigenous traditions. This produced the Maori, a volatile confederation of exiles, mercenaries, and desert tribes. Eventually, Rome conscripted these hardened syncretic groups as elite auxiliary cavalry. The African frontier was a highly complex, interconnected ecosystem of outcasts, martial, and religious groups hardened by centuries of imperial violence. Thousands of miles away, an entirely separate historical reality existed behind the absolute geographic barrier of the Atlantic Ocean. For millennia, the civilizations of the Americas developed in total planetary isolation from the Old World. This dual globe visualization compares the two distinct timelines. While the Afro-Eurasian landmass was locked in a continuous, violent cycle of empire building and displacement, the Americas operated on an independent trajectory. Indigenous American societies built their own massive empires, conducted complex wars, and managed vast trade networks. But they were entirely separate from the specific Roman legal codes of deportatio and the highly formalized Eurasian tradition of imperial exile. The Americas had never absorbed the Mediterranean frameworks of systemic religious persecution, nor the mass expulsion of marginalized ritual specialists. This is the Fra Mauro map, completed in 1459. On the very eve of the transatlantic crossing, European geographic knowledge was still entirely locked into the classical paradigms of antiquity. 15th century cartographers relied heavily on the ancient Ptolemaic labels of Libya and Ethiopia to understand the absolute limits of their world. The Atlantic Ocean had acted as a planetary quarantine, protecting the Americas from a deeply entrenched 2,000-year-old cycle of imperial penal settlement and frontier subjugation. The late 15th century encounter was a sudden, catastrophic system collision between two completely incompatible and entirely isolated historical realities. The European fleets crossing the Atlantic carried invisible, devastating historical baggage. This visualization maps the transfer of the Old World system. A fully mature algorithm for frontier exploitation was deployed directly into a virgin biosphere. The colonizing powers immediately imported the ancient mechanisms of the Mediterranean core: forced penal colonization, mass demographic enslavement, and the legal designation of indigenous populations as expendable outsiders. Over the following centuries, this exact algorithm of extraction rebounded back onto the African continent, evolving from Roman exile into industrial-scale terror. Colonial regimes, like the Congo Free State, governed by Belgium's Leopold II, operated on the exact same logic of remote extermination and forced labor pioneered by classical empires, resulting in the deaths of millions. The unbroken continuity of mass demographic destruction stretches directly into contemporary African history. We use modern legal terms like genocide today to describe events like the 1994 slaughter in Rwanda. But these contemporary atrocities are the direct structural descendants of ancient, normalized mass violence systems. The isolated civilizations of the Americas were violently forced to absorb an imperial machinery of exile, destruction, and marginalization that the Old World had spent 2 millennia perfecting.
Someone!